안녕하십니까? 제17회 제주 포럼에 참석해 주신 여러분 반갑습니다. 지금부터 동북아 군비 경쟁과 한반도 협력적 비핵화 방안 세션을 시작하겠습니다. 본 행사는 동시 통역이 제공되며 통역을 원하시는 분들께서는 자리에 놓여 있는 수신기를 착용하시기 바랍니다. 한국어 채널은 1번, 영어는 2번입니다. 감사합니다. 그럼 이번 세션의 진행을 맡아주실 좌장님을 소개해 드리겠습니다. 좌장님은 전봉근 국립외교원 교수님이십니다. 현재 국립외교원 외교안보연구소 외교전략센터 책임교수로 재직 중이시며 통일부 장관 정책보좌관 및 대통령실 국제안보비서관을 역임하셨고 북핵 문제, 남북관계, 핵비확산, 핵안보 및 핵에너지 정책 분야의 전문가이십니다.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 17th Jeju Forum. Thank you for joining us today for Arms Race in Northeast Asia and Cooperative Denuclearization of Korean Peninsula. Simultaneous interpretation is available for this session. For service in Korean, set your device on channel 1. For English, select channel 2. Now, I would like to hand over the stage to Professor Jeon Bong-gun of Korea National Diplomatic Academy, who will moderate this session. Everyone, please welcome Professor Jeon.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name is Jeon Bong-gun, professor of the Korean National Diplomatic Academy. We're going to talk about the arms race in Northeast Asia and cooperative denuclearization of Korean Peninsula. I'm your moderator for this session. It is my great pleasure to be the moderator for this session. Especially this session is hosted and organized by the Korean Institute for National Unification. As a North Korean researcher, it's my great pleasure to see the successful opening of it. For this session, actually, the situation on the Korean Peninsula is such a dire situation, and everyone would agree with it. For quite a long, North Korea nuclearization has been quite a trouble, and its nuclear threat as well. Over the last few days, North Korea's nuclear threat got kind of more sophisticated because North Korea recently announced new nuclear law that justifies the preemptive strike of nuclear ammunition for the protection of the regime. That means that the regime can launch a preemptive nuclear attack. From the perspective of North Korea, they said that they have no reason but to do it. However, that kind of justification has not been accepted by not just South Korea, but by any country. That is a violation of the international law and against the general principles of the international peace. Nonetheless, North Korea's nuclear situation has been remained unsolved for the last 3 decades, and the recent move of the North Korea tells that the advancement of the North Korean nuclearization has been happening continuously. Also, another threat in this region is the rivalry between U.S. and China and the arms race in the Northeast Asia. Today, the KINU prepared this timely session to discuss this issue of high importance. For this seminar, we're going to have an 80-minute discussion. So I'd like to give the floor to 3 presenters, introduce one by one. The detailed CV would not be necessary because there are 2 famous already in the field of academy, and you can visit the official website to see the details of the CV. So let me briefly introduce the speakers and discussants. First speaker is Mr. Park Hyung-jun, Distinguished Research Fellow of KINU. He has been working for the Unification Preparation Committee and has been an advisor for the Unification Committee, and also his area of research includes North Korea, its economy, and politics. Actually, he's one of the greatest experts in the field of North Korean economies and also North and South relationship and regime of autocracy. The second speaker is, as you can see on this Zoom screen, Mr. Hwang Il-do, professor of Korean National Diplomatic Academy. Professor Hwang has graduated, once worked for the academy just like me. His expertise includes the North Korean arms race in the Northeast Asian region. His publication includes the shooting of the fear by the leader Kim Jong-un. The third speaker is Director Hong Min of North Korea Research Division of Korean Institute for National Unification. He previously worked for the Ministry of Unification and the Ministry of Defense as a director, and as usual, as he did in the past, has been actively engaging in the policy division, and he is one of the greatest expertise in the field of North and South relations, especially when it comes to peace regime. His expertise is quite significant. Director Hong Min, welcome. The next person I'd like to introduce is the discussant. Actually, we have three discussants. First, Senior Researcher Fellow Kim Jin-ah of Korean Institute for National Unification. Mr. Kim also, like Mr. Hong, worked for the NINU and has been studying multiple policies relating to North Korea. Also, he is advisor of the National Unification Committee and the Purification Committee as an advisor in the past as well. The second discussant is Research Fellow Chung Eun-mi of Korean Institute for National Unification. Dr. Chung worked as the standing committee member of the Unification Committee, especially when it comes to the society of North Korea. Changes of the society of North Korea, perception of North Korea has been studied much by Dr. Chung. Last but not least, Director Wang Junxiang of the Chinese Academy of Social Science. Director Wang, currently working for the Chinese Academy of Social Science, especially Asia-Pacific Studies, and he is working as a director in the field of Asia-Pacific region, and also he was a liaison director for the Party of China or Communist Party of China. And it's my great pleasure to invite all the speakers of the great prominence to this session, and I believe that the discussion of the session will be quite meaningful. Without further ado, let me move on to the main section of the event. I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Park. He's going to talk about China, U.S., and the challenges for the Korean Peninsula and the future outlook of the Korean Peninsula. Mr. Park, like I said, studied the Korean Peninsula to understand the rivalry relation between the two Koreas and the strategic relation with the U.S. It will be reflected in his presentation as well.
Good afternoon. As I've been introduced, I'm Park Hyung-jung. Recently, I read a paper written by a U.S. scholar. It said, ever since the Second World War, when it comes to international politics, we are facing the most dangerous situation. So ever since the outbreak of the Second World War, we are facing the most dire threat now. And during this dangerous situation, great powers will have tensions. And while seeing those tensions, great powers, the relations between great powers will be established. And then, based on such power, a new international order will be structured. And such international structure will last 3 decades or 5 decades later. So, since the Second World War, great powers, tensions, and relations will be established newly, and in 5 or 10 years, those international orders will be confirmed. So because of relative powers, based on relative powers, the new orders will be established, and next 3 or 5 decades will be established by the new orders, and international frameworks are being shifted. It means that orders in the Korean Peninsula will automatically change. If you look at history between the two Koreas, as you remember, not just between the two Koreas, but also if you look at the history from the Joseon dynasty, the fate of the Korean Peninsula has not been decided on our own. It's been decided by other outer forces. This is what we remember. And the same goes for the division of the two Koreas. And ever since the division during the Cold War, inter-Korean relations, and after the Cold War, inter-Korean relations have developed as well. And behind such development, we need to look at international orders, in particular regional order in Northeast Asia, which is the key pillar. And if relative power relations change, then the two Koreas' relations will change as well. So the relations, power relations between the two Koreas are of course responsible for ourselves, but for many parts, great powers make decisions regarding the improvement and the development of inter-Korean relations. So when it comes to the two Koreas' rivalry, Korea is outpacing the North, but this is because the US has been outpacing China. So superiority of Korea depends on the US's power. And in 5 or in a decade, in particular in Northeast Asia, the US and its allies in India-Pacific area, so those allied countries will compete with China, which will lead to a new order. In particular, US-China rivalry, for that rivalry, for the next 5 to 10 years will be very critical. So in this decisive moment, we need to think about how the result will be, whether the US order will be restored or the Chinese leader will be newly established. We need to think about it. So China-led international order is established. If it is established, then we need to think about what kind of characteristics would it be having. So in particular, you may think the contribution system. So the regional orders are not just related to international orders, but it defines local orders. If the regional order is led by China, then Korea's internal orders will be highly likely to follow the Chinese-led international order. So we have been talking about US-China rivalry. If China-led order is established in Northeast Asia, and I believe the power relations between the two Koreas will be totally different. The North will outpace us. Because so, US-China competition will be a decisive factor for the fate of South Korea. It is closely related. And also, we are currently trying to deal with North Korea's nuclear weapons issues. But those nuclear issues, when it comes to nuclear issues, conflicts between the two Koreas are the most important issue. And the origin of nuclear issues goes back to the Cold War, when the power balance between the two Korea was broken. So it is a structural problem. So engagement or involvement of politicians are quite limited. And recently, Chairman Kim Jong-un created many conditions for the use of nuclear weapons. And I believe it shows the military rivalry between the two Koreas. First, it reflects the rivalry between US and China. And I believe this is the byproduct of the great powers relations. So we have experienced such process, and in particular when it comes to inter-Korean policy, we, Korea, have had many hopes, and we have been very optimistic. Sometimes we have been very narcissistic. And I put the word rivalry, and the most important element in rivalry is this. a leader of one country thinks of the other as an enemy, then a rivalry is established, is created. It implies that the one party regards the other party as an enemy, but the other party may regard you as a foe, a friend. Even in that case, a rivalry can be established. So if you look at U.S.-China relations in the 1990s, you can see how the U.S. regarded China. And it is quite different. In the first place, China has been thinking the United States as an enemy, and they have been using the United States. And until the 2000s, the United States had regarded China as a friend, but it turns out they were not. So that's why the U.S. started counterattack. And the same should go for the inter-Korean relations. And up to this point, we need to think about how we have seen the North. The way we see the North and the way the North see us will be very different from one another. So basic principles of inter-Korean policies of Korea are quite optimistic and hopeful, and sometimes, as I mentioned, narcissistic. We sometimes thought that the North will go collapsed, and sometimes the North will be a friend. So in a rapidly changing world, for our own survival, we need to have a better understandings regarding power competition between the two great powers, and we need to have a different views towards the North.
Yeah.
Mr. Park just made a presentation, and that was quite a provocative question thrown by Dr. Park. The issue of Korean Peninsula itself is not a self-dependent variable, but it is the factor that is influenced by the U.S.'s the hegemon war or the structure of the region, which might be led by China or by the U.S. Even internal dynamics of South Korea can change as well, he said. Also, the rivalry between South and North Korea tells that the perception of each other are quite different from one another, because we believe that North Korea can be generous in some days. We thought that South Korea took the initiative in terms of relationship with the North, but North thought very differently because they pursue their goals very unilaterally and in a consistent manner. If that's the case, we need to be more realistic, I believe, at least when it comes to Korean Peninsula, the nature of North Korea, nature of the inter-Korean relations, and also the power countries influencing the Korean Peninsula must be more thoroughly analyzed. Otherwise, without such realistic perception, we will make another mistake that we did in the past in terms of the diplomacy with these neighboring countries. So he just pointed out that kind of possible caveats that we need to pay attention to. Next, I'd like to give the floor to Professor Huang, and he's going to talk about the military strategy because this is expert areas of him. He also studied a lot of arms races, so he's going to talk about the structure characteristic of the arms race in North Korean Asia and its implication on the Korean Peninsula. You have also 8 minutes. My name is Professor Huang, and it's my great pleasure to meet my old colleagues in a while, and it's my great pleasure to be invited. Actually, I was supposed to go there, but actually I'm full on my plate because of the business trips and classes that I need to touch. My presentation, like you just said, is about the arms race in Northeast Asia and the flow and moves in this region and characteristics of them. And based on such understanding, I'm going to also talk about the characteristic of the issues on the Korean Peninsula and the implications associated with it and a possible detour that we may choose going forward. This is the first flow that I want to highlight. These are something you must be familiar with already. Major countries in this region has been very much engaged in arms race, and these are some of the characteristics of it. One noteworthy feature is that, as you already know, at the end of the Cold War, we move into the post-Cold War era, and many arms control took place, but those mechanisms started to be broken into pieces recently. The beginning could be different or vary, and as old as in 2002, ABM agreement broke apart, and also INF treaty got annulled as at the latest example. So that kind of missile had been controlled, but that kind of controlling is not working anymore these days because implicit agreement between the major countries got kind of broken apart. And because of such disagreement, the missile density has been increasing continuously. And actually this region boasts one of the most dense missile population. Also, recently, the U.S. announced the so-called JADO, Joint All-Domain Operation Strategy, and that strategy has been implemented by the U.S. to rebalance the power struggle in this region. Especially, they try to create one single control center to implement all the missile strategies. This is not just about the U.S. assets. All the assets of the ally countries would be controlled by the U.S. this single center if you know the details of the concept of JADO. And because of this JADO strategy, the missile strategy of the Korea and Japan has been very much supported by the U.S. recently. In case of China, the situation or context might be different, but actually in the big picture, the move are quite going to the same direction. The China also gave some signal that the path it will take might be different in the future. But still, I don't think that the China is off track. However, recently, ICBM reinforcement or force, this kind of new assets being tested shows that the China will reinforce its missile ammunition going forward. So in the past, the deterrence by punishment has been controlled, had been controlled in the past. Nowadays, preemptive strike is very much prioritized in the name of the deterrence by denier. So this deterrence by denier has been very much prioritized by many countries in this region. So these new changes in this region provoked South Korea, and South Korea's move provoked others. So this kind of security dilemma has been witnessed in the region of Northeast Asia. One biggest problem I need to mention is that actually in the past, NATO, Warsaw members had a conflict, but nowadays this is a conflict of the multilateral nature. So CSCE or CSBM cannot be very much applied to the current conflict in this region of multilateral nature. Actually, there is difference in terms of geology as well. In case of Europe, CSBM or CBM played a role as a stabilizer because all the war will be assumed to take place on the ground. So ambush attack on the ground was a main piece of the CBM or CSBM. So that is why CBM has been considered as a very effective tool for the European region. But in case of Northeast Asian region, there are not much countries that are in the vicinity close to one another. Rather, the ocean stands in the middle between the two countries. So that means that PGM, precise guided missiles, or the Air Force or Marine forces would be more important in case of North Korea, Northeast Asia. We need to use this lens when we talk about the North Korean nuclear issue as well. The recent move of North Korea tells that the deterrence by punishment of the nuclear weapon is kind of ignored these days. They are trying to use it as an actual forces against the South Korea to overcome the power imbalance in terms of traditional power. So that also shows a transition from the deterrence by punishment into deterrence by denial. Some may say that this is an evolution of the strategy. So this kind of evolution from the perspective of South Korea or from the perspective of Northeast Asian region will be very dismal because it will aggravate instability in this region and the possibility of nuclear war can be increased. So this kind of extreme nuclearization or self-defense oriented deterrence by denial also tells that this is the reality. So this kind of nature of North Korea nuclearization should be talked beyond a simple inter-Korean relation context because the possibility of using nuclear is quite imminent. That threat is imminent on the Korean Peninsula these days. South Korea, U.S., Japan are stakeholders of it, and also China is also stakeholders of it because the use of nuclear weapon by North Korea will uncivilize China as well. So so-called new Cold War regime or bloc creation of its region or Russia-U.S. rivalry all tells the transition that I just talked. Also, recent move of North Korea tells that military conflict between the two Koreas might happen and is very much likely because of this instability factors in this region, and it will create nuclear instability, not just on the Korean Peninsula, but in the Northeast Asia. So all the region, all the countries in this Northeast Asia might be endangered. So we need to kind of shed a light on it so that the U.S. and China can play an active role in stabilizing in this region. But my final comment would be on the traditional arms race, because in the past, missile was the centerpiece of the arms race, and that is because they emphasized the ground war. But like I said, we need to change our perspective. On a positive note, one thing I can say is that maybe we can stop this transition. And what I meant by the transition, the denial of the transition is that there could be multiple reasons for this transition of the North Korea, but one of them is that it's too burdensome for North Korea to maintain the large size of the forces because they need to enhance the missile forces, and at the same time they need to enhance or strengthen the ground forces, or they need to improve the roles of the military forces of South Korea to expand its roles. So-called special brigade of the North Korea nowadays need to go outside of North Korea to earn foreign currency, and that could be seen as a prestige for the military forces of North Korea. But that should be controlled by the Central Party, and if that is possible, the Korean Workers' Party will make some changes positively. So arms race, whether it is structural or operational, will be kind of shaped by North Korea as well because there could be clear needs. Another thing I need to highlight is the demographic change. Youngster is very scarce, not just in South Korea, but in North Korea as well. The younger population has been decreasing rapidly. So because of such demographic change, North Korea now realize that they cannot maintain the current power with this shrinking youngsters. In the past, European countries also had the same issue demographically, and that played a role in the past as well. From that perspective, I think we need to also use this kind of rationale when we negotiate with North Korea regarding nuclear issue. To summarize, all the trends of arms race in Northeast Asia have some implication, and we need to have some thought on this kind of implication as in depth. Neighboring countries in this region will reinforce PGM and missile strategies if that's the case. Focusing on PGM would be not realistic for South Korea because if you need to reduce the missile powers, there will be some disagreement from others. So rather than maybe we can pay more attention to the ground forces and based on it, maybe we can connect it with the denuclearization consensus with North Korea. That would be a very critical point at this moment of time. One thing I'd like to say as a last comment is that back in 1980s or 90s, we had a discussion, similar discussion in Europe for the denuclearization. And the umbrella agreement was made for the arms control in the past, and that kind of umbrella agreement played a critical role. That means that all the discussion with North Korea will be on track in some days, and if that happens, we need to have the kind of traditional arms-based arms control discussion with North Korea to realize denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula. That could be very challenging, or it could be seen as an opportunity, as a leverage effect. Thank you so much for your kind of listening.
예,
Thank you very much, Dr. Huang, for your remarks. We are a bit behind the schedule, but anyway, when it comes to the trends of arms race in the Korean Peninsula and Northeast Asia, and future arms control negotiations possibility have been covered in an interesting way, in a new way as well. So he made a new proposal, so I believe that's why we gave him a bit more time than expected and scheduled. In particular, Professor Huang might want to emphasize this. A lot of military arms races trends in Europe, in particular, such arms race, for example, OSCU or mutual trust building process, are hard to be applied to Northeast Asia. So he wants to say that landscape of Northeast Asia is quite dire and serious. And considering the North Korea's trends and the European trends, in conventional area, arms control could be improved and there is enough room for improvement. So this is what he covered through his interesting presentation. And next, we are going to invite Director Hong Min so that he's going to talk about arms race in Northeast Asia and cooperative denuke of Korean Peninsula.
입니다.
Greetings, my name is Hong Min from the KINU. The previous speakers talk about the big picture of the arms race in Northeast Asia. Rather, I'm going to focus on the microscopic aspect, the enactment of the new North Korea nuclear law, and how South Korea has to respond to it. Since I don't have much time, I'll be very quick. Leader of North Korea, Kim, specifically tell that it will not negotiate the denuclearization. Denuclearization is not possible at all in any cases, said the leader of the regime. Secondly, he said that the CNC, the legal responsibility of CNC was kind of disclosed. And third, the expansion of the South and U.S. cooperation gave a chance to North Korea to reinforce its forces as well. So the media outlet and expert all said that this is quite hostile. The announcement was very hostile and aggressive. And I don't agree with this interpretation necessarily because the speech of Kim Jong-un had 2 points. First, nuclear weapon will be used as a protection tool for the regime legally, and that legal protection was announced. And second, the negotiation is not subject to negotiation. Non-negotiable was announced by North Korea at all. So that the line was clearly drawn by North Korea. But North Korean nuclear weapon has two main elements. First, nuclear element, physical element, and second is nuclear doctrine. So this is not a physical layer. This doctrine suggests that North Korea has kind of verbal ownership of the use of nuclear weapon. So capability need to be showcased by North Korea. So when and how it can be used should be disclosed, and that kind of credibility need to be obtained. So the announcement of the recent announcement of leader Kim, all about the deterrence by saying that it will not negotiate the nuclear weapon. And it was also about the deterrence against the U.S., but actually there was more than that. Because if you read between the lines, the North Korea also talked about the possible anti-North Korean activities of a specific country. Without specifying a country, the North Korea continuously talked about the deterrence necessity. From some perspective, North Korea, of course, need to do something against the U.S. In order to make it happen, the North Korea had to disclose systemic doctrine of the use of the nuclear weapon to tell the world that in any time possible, North Korea will use the nuclear weapon. So that kind of verbal announcement was necessary for North Korea to express its will to use the nuclear weapon, and that can create kind of deterrence effect. But that deterrence effect has one more layer on it as well, because this expression is clear example. The military conflict in this region get prolongated, and the conflict in this region is unavoidable. And North Korea and South Korea war can be deterred by the ownership of nuclear weapon by North Korea. That kind of speech tells the world view of North Korea. In this post-Cold War era, this is an interpretation of North Korea of the world of today. So unwanted war might occur, and North Korea had to have some kind of tool to prevent itself from being involved or engaged in such unwanted war. That war might be spread across the Taiwan region because of the U.S. and China rivalry. If that kind of rivalry expanded up to the or down to the Korean Peninsula region, the North Korea need to have some kind of solution to it, and that first solution came as early as from October last year. So deterrence against the U.S. is one piece of North Korea's strategy, and possible deterrence against the possible spread of the conflict in this region is another kind of intention of the announcement. The non-negotiable aspect of the nuclear power development. Actually, in 2017, Hanoi No Deal clearly evidenced that North Korea is not willing to accept the denuclearization. They even said that the formula have to be changed to resume the negotiation. At the 8th Party Congress, the bar were even higher. They even refused to do any negotiation unless they decided not to talk about anything about denuclearization. So the total blanket denier was announced by North Korea, because South Korea and the U.S. assumed that denuclearization should be part of the unification process, but that kind of approach has been totally denied by North Korea and requested by North Korea that it will not happen at all in the future. Another thing I need to mention, this is quite important as well, is that the arms race of South Korea and hostile policies of the U.S. against North Korea gave kind of a chance for North Korea to reinforce its forces. In this modern war, they need to develop modern weapons as well, and they need to also practice modern weapons as well. Also, strategic nuclear weapons will be reinforced and strengthened as well. Whether it will happen or not, that clearly tells the intention of North Korea, because I thought that if you see the recent nuclear law of North Korea, this is very similar to the review of the U.S. scholars on North Korean nuclear weapons. Capability, policy, and strategy. Usage strategies are the three elements of the NPR of the North Korea. So they are not totally similar, but totally the same, but very much similar. This new law kind of responds to the NPR of the U.S., in my opinion, because in 2022, the Biden announced NPR and just one page summary was announced. But in 2018, another summary was made, which is quite similar to the 2022 version. But the difference was that in 2018, it was quite controversial, because flexibility-based customized nuclear strategy and low-intensity strategic nuclear weapon will be deployed were the basic element of the 2018 report as well as 2022. It tells that the U.S. is willing to use nuclear weapon whenever it is possible, so the barrier of using nuclear weapon got kind of lowered in 2022 NPR, and many worry that the risk will be more serious because of the NPR. I believe the North Korea kind of trying to mimic the rhetoric of the NPR. Not totally the same, but I do believe that they use the U.S. NPR as a reference for their strategy, law. The fundamental transition of the U.S. North Korea is being requested by North Korea. We will not give up on the nuclear weapon, but at least we can talk about the limited arms race, and we might accept it if it is viable for North Korea. So that kind of fundamental transition is being requested by North Korea. I don't think that it will be easily accepted by the U.S., but anyway, it is requested by the U.S. Also, the new law tells that the evaluation will be made in a consistent manner regarding the nuclear threat of other countries, and reinforcement of nuclear weapon or capability will be done consistently. So, like NPR, a regular monitoring report will be produced by North Korea. And it is possible that the deterrence against the U.S. and evaluation on it and possible use of nuclear weapon will be monitored and evaluated, and as well and the U.S.-China rivalry and the North Korea-U.S. rivalry, all the nuclear readiness postures will be all evaluated and monitored and will be included in this report to justify the use of the nuclear weapon by the North Korean regime. So regardless of actual capability, at least at the verver layer, they try to mimic the NPR rhetoric to show its kind of willingness to deter the U.S. by the use of North Korean weapon. So this North Korean version of NPR or monitoring report of North Korea is similar to what Putin did. Actually, Putin made an announcement at the Congress in the past, and that was quite controversial because SLCM and low intensity warhead submarine missiles will be deployed in the Far East region, and that was very shocking news to the U.S. So the U.S. announced the NPR and also say the same rhetoric to do the same deployment. So that kind of counter deployment was done in the Russia. So the U.S. kind of learned a lesson from the U.S. Russian move as well. So what would be the actual implication on the Korean Peninsula? And I believe this is similar to the nuclear propaganda moves, because usually doctrine is formed when operational strategies and plans are envisaged in a very realistic manner. On top of that, nuclear weapon usage should be part of it as well. But up until 2013, everything they talk about were kind of normative. This is how we're going to use it when. However, this new law is very detailed about the usage and operation of the nuclear weapons. This detailed operational plans tells that the U.S. will make an arbitrary choice to use the nuclear weapon against the U.S. to use it as a deterrence tool by denier. So some might say that this is a rhetoric deterrence. So regardless of actual use of it, it could be seen as very deterrent and defensive as well. Also, recently, the media outlet paid much attention to the 5 conditions of the use of nuclear weapon, and we need to pay attention to these 5 conditions as well. Back in 2019 and 2013, those milestones taught us that the doctrine of North Korea has been modified and revised. And if you see this revision, it is very close to the recent North Korea new nuclear law. Of course, there are some additions were made regarding the actual usage of it, but nothing is very new. So it is just more than aggressive and hostile announcement. It could be also seen as very defensive. Also, the U.S. announced the NPR to set the condition of the use of the nuclear weapon, and all the counterparts can be found in the recent North Korea nuclear law. Also, they talked about when the U.S. will do the preemptive nuclear attack. So the biggest threat of the North Korea against the U.S. has been all written in this law. So that's why I think this new law can be also seen as very much defensive. So the question here is the timing. Why now? In 2022. Of course, there could be multiple interpretation, but my choice of interpretation is that in 2000, in the previous October, the China did the National People's Congress, and that played a critical role in making North Korea making such an announcement. So U.S., Russia, and U.S., China, all the possible conflict might make North Korea to do unwanted engagement. But at the same time, the isolated North Korea need to evaluate the North Korea-U.S. rivalry, and they need to kind of seize a chance in those schism of the conflicts. And in that context, the North Korea is trying to be more kind of decisive against the rivalry issues in the neighboring regions. And from the perspective, the North Korea announced its own position on the ownership or expectation on the use of the North Korean weapon, and they let the world know about this kind of expectation so that the China can do something about the U.S., and maybe they even want China to join forces with North Korea in some aspect, if I say the new law announcement. So that is about the summary of my recent study. Finally, I'd like to talk about some alternative interpretation. So given that North Korea will not do the denuclearization, but that does not mean that South Korea should give up on the denuclearization. Denuclearization can be the final destination still, but we need to be more flexible, and that means that we need to change the frame of North Korea policies. We need to first think about where we can reduce the security threats. Maybe you can start small and then gradually go to the final destination. So maybe North Korea can be kind of the gate of the stabilization. I don't have a specific name for it, but cooperative denuclearization possibility must be envisaged gradually by South Korea. Also, reality and basic principles are not much working because denuclearization is the final destination, but that kind of final destination will not be played as a intermediate destination if you say the current situation in this region. So like I said, the final destination is denuclearization, but we need to have multiple channels and options that take us to that final destination. So I have many things to share, but please refer to my study if you want to know about the details of my presentation.
예, 홍민 박사.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hong, for your remarks. So I believe reference materials are available to all of you, and please refer them. And a few days ago, the North released Nuclear Forces Act on 9th September. So he has talked a lot about how to interpret the act. So the North said they will do as it says, and they can do. So there is an opinion that it is a nuclear propaganda of the North, and some say the North showed its defensive characteristics, and we need to consider those characteristics. And over the last 3 decades, we have been committed to the denuclearization of the North, but we have failed, it seems like that. Then the goal of denuclearization should be remained, but we need to consider reality so that we should set up new goals which are a bit more realistic to achieve the denuke of the Korean Peninsula. And cooperative approach or cooperative denuclearization approaches were covered by Dr. Hong. We have about 30 minutes left, so from now on, I'm going to manage the time very strictly. So for each panelist, I'm going to give you only 5 minutes, so within 5 minutes, please give comments or ask any questions if you have. And then we are going to receive some questions from the floor since we have many participants on site. So if you have any opinions or questions from the floor, then we will receive it and then give another opportunities to panelists to give answers or comments. Then Dr. Kim, please go ahead, and I'd like to ask you, please be on time in 5 minutes. Good afternoon. I'm Jinha Kim of KINU. So previous speakers made a lot of good points, so I will be brief. And regarding Professor Park's presentation, he talked about very strong structural structures. And in Northeast Asia, new polarization, new competition will happen. So I believe the interpretation of constraint would be right. So depending on the US-China relations, he said intercurrent relations will be decided, but that's not the case. The China's movement and the North's movement will create huge constraints. And also, the new Cold War has been talked a lot about by many speakers, but still we are not in the new Cold War. We are not sure whether multipolars will be happening or just polarization will happen. So in a transition period, in particular, middle and small allies and their roles are very important. And Korea should be well aware of this. So we are so accustomed to polarizations. So strategic mistakes and polarization mistakes are quite affordable, but that is not the case today. So depending on the sources of danger or risks, we need to respond to them. And to protect, we need to think about whether we should be aligned, or sometimes we need to think about there are too many risks and too much risks. So we need to be very careful. So rather than having some decisive views, we need to think about what we should do and what we need to do, and we need to have a better understanding. So this is my personal opinion regarding Professor Park's presentation. And regarding Professor Huang's presentation, he mentioned the current status. So I'm a bit confused. In Northeast Asia, unlike Europe, so multiple security dilemmas are existing. So, but I don't have a better understanding of it. Korea and Japan are fighting with one another, or Korea, Russia are fighting one another. So it's like there might be some security dilemmas between blocks, but I don't think there are multiple dilemmas when it comes to security. So I have some confusion regarding the understanding of concepts. And Professor Hong said rhetoric but not aggressive. But I believe it is the North is very aggressive. And regarding the North Korean nuclear weapons issues, we have many debates and discussions. And we have been saying retaliation-based or punishment-based retaliation or other aggressive nuclear attacks could be delivered by the North. So we have any question regarding whether the North is capable of carrying out aggressive nuclear attacks. But since this year, the North has made a lot of announcements regarding nuclear doctrine, but they made acts which I believe is very assertive and aggressive. And many scholars of nuclear issues have some mistakes regarding its dictatorships. Sometimes we underestimate it, but I believe, so compared to our legislation or codification, North Korea is a bit more complying with their laws and acts. So nuclear deterrence, I believe it is very aggressive escalation as a nuclear strategy. So it is very scary. We need to be thoroughly prepared. And also, Professor Chun mentioned that I'm not sure that was at the session or not. Of course, we need to think about the denuclearization, but also we need to be prepared to be equipped with deterrence capabilities. It's the prime time. So we, Korea, should expand our deterrence, whether it is on our own or it is by others. So that's my opinion. Thank you.
Yeah,
So he gave us multiple comments to each speaker, so I don't think that I need to repeat the comment on each speaker. So each speaker will respond to it later. And I'd like to give a floor to Dr. Chung. Actually, the title of this session is not my league, so it is not proper for me to make a comment on the three presentation. Rather, I'd like to ask some question to some of the speakers as a discussant. So Dr. Hong briefly mentioned that why it has to be now, the legislation has to happen now, and why the announcement need to be made publicly to the global community. That strategic intention is being kind of questioned by many. North Korea, at the last wave of the COVID pandemic, said that the North Korea found the reason for it. Because of the South Korea, the North Korea ended up being like this, and retaliation will happen, the North Korea said. So we thought about what will happen, what kind of retaliation would be made by North Korea, assumed by many. But that kind of provocation or retaliation, one example of such retaliation would be this legislation, possibly, I thought. Also, Dr. Hong, in his presentation, said that this new law should be seen as quite defensive. If that's the case, North Korea at this moment of time legislated the so-called Nuclear Power Neutralization Policy Act. So that means that the North Korea felt quite high fear and something had to be going on. So that kind of fear had to be explained to fully understand the background of the legislation and why that kind of announcement made in a decisive manner or for the deterrence nature. But the question here is that Mr. Kim, in his recent speech, said that there will be no negotiation on the denuclearization, and it is not subject to any negotiation empathized by the regime leader. But it also said that the world has changed first, and also the military environment on the Korean Peninsula should change first. That kind of precondition was clearly mentioned. That precondition, change of the military condition, would be something that is related to what Dr. Park said, the security environment in this region, or cooperative, the security framework transition. There could be some relations between the two, I thought. So that means that the nuclear issue of the North Korea might not be subject to negotiation, but also could be subject to negotiation if the environment change, if you think about that kind of precondition. Professor Huang also said that the recent move of North Korea pose quite a significant threat to North Korea, he predicted at the end of his presentation. But if you see the preface of this North Korean new law, the use of North Korean nuclear weapon can be used as a deterrence against the possible nuclear war in this region. For example, between China and Taiwan. So that kind of rivalry or conflicts are being kind of read by North Korea. If there should be further nuclear weapon tests in North Korea, that might tell the sign to China. But at the same time, the North Korea give some kind of notification to China. Do you think that will happen? That is a question to Mr. Huang. Also, I have a question to Mr. Park as well. Around the Korean Peninsula, there are many rivalry relations, which is very long-standing and kind of fixed structure. This kind of strategic rivalries, how should I say, should be deconstructed, but what would be the precondition for such deconstruction? Because if you try to be a friendly, I mean that sometimes the nations can be friends to each other and rivalry to each other, and that kind of transition will happen continuously in the future going forward. So is it possible to propose alternative besides such a transition? That is a question to Professor Park.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Zhang. And Dr. Zhang studied society of North Korea, but I believe on behalf of many scholars, she made a lot of questions. In particular, I can relate to some questions she proposed. So, Korean Peninsula issues, military conflict possibilities between the two Koreas, and military issues. War created in the Cold War structure and the division structure. Then by changing the characteristics of the division and the Cold War, then the rivalry between the two Koreas could be eased, or the necessity of the North Korea to be equipped with the nuclear power could be eased. So I guess she asked similar questions. And last but not least, Director Wang Junxiong, please go ahead.
Okay, thanks for chairman. Yeah, it's my great pleasure to be here. Yeah, I think in this panel there are a lot of negative words we hear, such as the Cold War structure, the North Korea problem, how China and U.S. compete each other. Yeah, just as a Chinese scholar, I want to give some ideas to this panel. The firstly, as Professor Park mentioned, the structure is very important. Then my question is, what's the relation between, the relation between China and the U.S. with the relation between two Koreas? So I think inter-Korea relations may be dominated by major power relations. My point is, if the major power relations, the cooperation between China and the U.S. goes very well, the situation in Korea Peninsula may be very well. But in very recent years, we can see the situation, just as we mentioned, a very, very dire situation. Maybe one very important reason is China and the U.S. cannot cooperate very well. Maybe secondly, what's the differences between China and the U.S. Related to Korea Peninsula policy? I think the position is a very, very important geopolitical viewpoint. Also can analyze this. As we know, China is more than any other country. We want to realize peace and stability in Korea Peninsula. But we can see from U.S. viewpoint, just want to, state the quo. The reason behind of these differences is because from Chinese viewpoint, Korea Peninsula is our neighboring area. if the situation is very, very complex, even, instabilized in this area, China's interest, even core interest, can be affected directly. So I think China is more than any other major countries want to see peace and stability in this area. But as we know, from U.S. side, Korea Peninsula is very far from their mainland. Another point I want to share is how to view the relations among China, U.S., and the two Koreas. Yeah, I think it's a very, very complex picture, very complex picture. The number one is we should remember clear. China and North Korea are totally different, totally different. When we analyze the situation in Korea Peninsula situation, maybe we always maybe treat China and North Korea as alliance. But I think we should remember, yeah, China and the U.S., China and North Korea are totally different, such as in nuclear issue, China totally opposed North Korea, for nuclear test, yeah, even middle test. Number two, yeah, China want keep the relation with U.S. stability. We discussed a lot about the competition between China and the U.S. But from Chinese viewpoint, yeah, we want the relation between China and U.S. to be stable, Even in Korea Peninsula, maybe issues, problems, we want to cooperate with U.S. As we can understand, if there are no close cooperation, no stable relations with the U.S., maybe China, the situation not only in the neighboring area, but in the whole world, for China may be very, very big problem. Lastly, I think the relation between China and ROK is very, very important. Yeah, in recent years, yeah, there are a lot of arguments. Think we treat China and ROK as a strategic competition. I totally disagree with this. Yeah, I think China treat ROK as a very, very important partner. Yeah, not only bilateral economical cooperation, but also regional and global issues. A lot of, proofs can prove these arguments. In this week, China's top legislator, Li Zhanshu, also will with ROK. My last, my last sentence, my last point is, we discussed so much, the passive or negative words, such as their situation, nuclear issue, even the nuclear war. How go out of this situation? Even we talk about the deterrence. I think maybe the answer is a close cooperation among critical countries, especially China and ROK. The best deterrence, in my viewpoint, is a close cooperation among the critical countries, such as China and the US, China and ROK. Okay, I think I will stop here. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Wang. 저희들이 세 분의
So we listened to the three presentation and three comments of the discussant, and we have 11 minutes remaining. So I'd like to give some minutes for each speaker. Be precise, and actually, I failed to manage the time properly as a moderator, so we don't have much time. So if there's any question from the floor, this is time for you to ask a question, or you can share a comment. Please, any. Maybe I can give a minute or two to share some comment. And please identify yourself before asking a question or making a comment, as well as your name. Greetings. My name is Kim Young-won, professor of the Korea National Diplomatic Academy. I learned a lot. So since you don't have time, I'll be very quick because you are already familiar with what I have to say. I have a question to Professor Wang. A while ago, Kim Jong-un said that it will not give up on the nuclear weapon at all in any cases. But you clearly says that from the Chinese standpoint, you are against the North Korea's use of nuclear power. So all the countries around this region need to cooperate together for the stabilization of the Korean Peninsula. So Chinese leader must say something about the North Korea's recent law. So what is the position of China about the legislation of North Korea's new nuclear law? Do you think that it's okay for North Korea to make such announcement, or do you think that China needs to say something about North Korea's recent legislation?
예, 김 박사님 감사합니다.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kim. So if I may add some comments, in Northeast Asia, China is the only nuclear weapon state recognized by the NPT, and the only member of the P5 in Northeast Asia. So considering China's positions for the denuclearization of the North, I believe China has legally obliged for the denuclearization, but actions taken by China has not been enough, I guess. So what is your take on this? And any further questions from the floor? If there's no question, then speakers and panelists Wang, I'd like to give microphones so they can give answers. We have only 9 minutes left. So please give answers in 2 or 3 minutes. And since we are broadcasting the session, so we need to be on time. So please be brief. And first, Professor Park, please go ahead. And thank you very much for this question. So the term rivalry was used by me, but the rivalry doesn't necessarily mean that the advancement into the Cold War. And during the rivalry, the level of conflicts and tensions could change time by time. So sometimes detente could be done, but basically rivalry goes on. Then there are some conditions to resolve rivalry. So first, the one side should be surrendered to the other side, acknowledge its superiority, and that is the essence. And on the surface, compromise and reconciliation, rapprochement. So it can be applied to Sino-Korean or US-China relations. And if you look at the inter-Korean structures, and Chairman Kim mentioned 5 conditions, and we don't have to be provocated, and we need to accept it. And we need to acknowledge the reality that we accept it, and we need to respond it in an objective manner. So the case in point is denuclearization. Of course, commitment to the denuclearization is important, but it is our wish at this point. Our wish is unification. And no one says we don't have to do unification, but unification is our wish, literally, and the denuclearization, I believe, is one of our wishes like unification. And we need to be realistic that denuclearization has become our wish. And if the division and the Cold War are disintegrated, then North Korean nuclear issues will disappear. But we need to think that the Cold War and the division will not be disintegrated, and we need to prepare for strategies. And Professor Wang made a good point. So one message to China is this. So there are many concerns in Korea regarding China's actions and China's attitude. So I guess we have another time to have detailed discussion regarding this. And I guess I need to talk a lot of issues with the 2 speakers, but I will do it later.
말
And also, before I give the floor to next person, I'd like to give the floor to Professor Wang first and listen to his answer because he is far away. And thank you so much for your participation despite the distance. I'd like to give the floor to you first.
Okay, okay. Thanks. Yeah, I think for China, we are also unhappy for North Korea's nuclear law. Yeah, I think what China can do is very limited. There are some reasons. Number one is, as we know, China's influence toward North Korea is very limited. If we want to say something, but North Korea doesn't hear, we have no way. We have no way, as we know. So secondly, I think the main problem is a U.S. side. I mean, because of what U.S. policy. As we understand, what North Korea really need, such as a security guarantee and the better relations with between North Korea and the U.S., only can be satisfied by U.S. If China wanted to do something, I think China cannot replace U.S. U.S. The last reason, I think, maybe because the current relation between China and the U.S. Has a bigger problem. As we can understand, China, U.S. is so-called Indo-Pacific. The main target is China. U.S. use every leverage to contain China. This is the same story with the Korea Peninsula issues. Among Chinese scholars, many of us think what the U.S. Korea Peninsula policy recent years has been changed a lot. Maybe several years ago, China and the U.S. we have a common interest, we can cooperate. But very recent years, especially since Trump took office, maybe just to use Korea Peninsula issues as a bargaining chip, as a leverage to contain China. So from Chinese scholar perspective, I think we have no choice. So this is why I reiterate the cooperation between China and ROK is very, very important. Okay, I will stop here.
예, 왕 교수님.
Thank you so much for your answer. So that is something. Actually, we need to find another occasion to continue the discussion later because we don't have much time. I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Huang. Then you have just 1 minute because we have only 3 minutes left. I'll be very brief because you talked about the multilateral security dilemma. Let me put it this way: INF fought apart because China needs to be part of it. The presence of China should be the pre-existence of the INF. So that would be the great example. And also Korea and the U.S. has security dilemma as well. It has been subsided, but that happened up until last year. Also, North Korea strengthened the nuclear armament, and the U.S. expanded its ICBM in Alaska. So this is also a new security dilemma. That's why I use the term the multilateral security dilemma. So regarding the legislation, we need to have a seminar specialized specifically about the new law of the North Korea. I will talk with the people to have the kind of session later. Mr. Hong, you are the next. So Mr. Chong gave me, Ms. Chong gave me a question. Like you said, after the October Party Congress of China, the summit was expected. And that was what Mr. Kim said briefly. So China's stance on the nuclear weapon of North Korea will not be announced at the Congress. However, before resuming the term, Premier Xi will maybe have a good understanding of the intention of the North Korea's announcement, and also China and Russia also have that kind of understanding as well. So that kind of message has been clearly delivered from North Korea to China and Russia. Also, U.S. and China rapidly moved to expand the deterrence power, and that pose another threat to North Korea regime as well. Also, recently, many people are saying that the nuclear tests are imminent, and I personally thought that it will not happen within this year. But if you see the legislation, I told you that this is a verbal threat. However, it is almost tantamount to the nuclear test. The willingness of the using nuclear weapon and strengthening of nuclear armament were kind of showcased in the recent statement. So that kind of intention is clearly visible. And if you see the details of the speech of regime leader Kim, it is very not logical and unstructured, unlike the previous narrative structure of North Korea. So that kind of typical structure is absent, so much unorganized. That means that the North Korea rapidly wrote down something or even jot down something, and because it is too unstructural. Nonetheless, if you see the details of the speech, you can clearly read the fear or the frustration going on, because the commodity is not very much supplied to the North Korean population. So that kind of difficulty or the frustration is clearly evident. So instead of making some aggressive statement, the leader wanted to say something to control that kind of frustration and possibly fear of the population as well. So if someone tells me why it has been now, I'll say this is because of the frustration.
되어서
Since time's up, we'd like to wrap up the session. And in my opinion, for many years, the Korean Peninsula have had and experienced many characteristics and issues. In Northeast Asia, the Korean Peninsula is the smallest one, but for about 1,000 and 1,500 years, we have been resilient and we have been resistant to maintain ourselves as a state. And one more thing, when strong powers competition going on in Northeast Asia, whether it be between the northern China or the northern Japan or the US or Soviet or the US and China, every time strong powers are competing with one another, we, the Korean Peninsula, has been sandwiched and faced a lot of challenges, and which caused North Korean issues as well as the division of the Korean Peninsula. And also, today's theme has been covered in a dire situation today when it comes to arms race and stability and peace on the Korean Peninsula. So new questions and new topics and new solutions. So were the one we try to find out at this session. In that regard, today's forum was very meaningful. So I'd like to once again thank the KINU for organizing and preparing this event, and my special thanks go to President Ko for organizing this event. And once again, I'd like to extend my gratitude to all the panelists, speakers, and distinguished participants for your presence. So with this, we'd like to conclude the session. Thank you very much.
으로 세션을 마치겠습니다. 잠시 휴식 시간을 가진 뒤 계속해서 다음 세션이 진행될 예정이오니 많은 참여 부탁드립니다. 감사합니다.